Chapter 33 Tawnod and Ashnod. The last battle began before dawn, as the overcast sky was just beginning to lighten. The remaining mechanics on both sides began activating their destructive artifacts, and the thrumming of their engines was a bugle call to both sides. The vibrations grew on both sides as more wings were limbered, treads were checked, and leg armatures were put through their final preparations. With the first light of dawn, the dragon engines surged forward, forming a wedge and bearing down on the Argivian position. Behind them lumbered two huge flanks of transmogrants, and the remaining Philigi soldiers decked in Ashnod's spiked armor. Bringing up the rear were Mishra's great ground-shattering engines and war machines, protecting the flanks of the wedge. Behind these lines rose a dozen winged dragon engines, bugling battle cries and breathing flames into the morning air. Urza had guessed his brother would try a direct assault, counting on the weakened state of the Argivian forces after their battle with the Argothians. For that reason he positioned all Tawnod's mobile fortifications, the Triskelions, in the center, supported by war engines of the Lord Protector's own design. The rest of his units were broken into smaller groups of clay statues, avengers, and sentinels. Shape-shifting automatons, made of primal clay worked over adjustable frames, held the flanks. The sky was alive with ornithopters and ornibombers, protected by tetravi and clockwork avians that swarmed upward toward the great flying dragon engines of the enemy. The armies crashed together with a scream of shattering metal. The dragon engines on the ground moved among the Triskelions, hammering them with flame and savage blows, but the great fortresses refused to fall. Urza's war machines were smashed beneath the treads of the dragon engines, slowing them while hordes of avengers and clay statues clung to their flanks seeking to break through their armor to the driving motors within and destroy them. The dragon engines screamed, and the transmogrants fell upon Urza's flanks. The remade troops were picking at the clay statues like carnivorous apes, but Urza's newer shape-shifting automatons were too much for the reanimated forms of men and elves. Old blood and new oil splattered on the combatants as they slammed into each other. In the air the clockwork avians swooped and dived at the dragon engines, seeking the weakness in their armor that would allow them to penetrate and spread packets of explosives within. Occasionally there was a metallic scream as an ornibomber or dragon engine lost structural integrity and could no longer remain aloft. The huge engines sprawled into the seething madness below, crushing both ally and enemy beneath their sprawling hulks. On the far right flank, Tawnod led a squad of Yatian soldiers, heavily armored and looking more like beetles than humanoid automatons, looking for a way into the rear echelon of Mishra's forces. He held aloft the sensory-dampening wand that he had days earlier offered Harbin, and none of the other combatants seemed to notice him or his patrol. There was motion ahead of him, and Tawnod barked a command. The soldiers formed a wedge behind the old scholar, raising blades made of tempered glass that could cut through steel. Tawnod snapped the attack command, and they lumbered forward, their servos and governing mechanisms clicking as they sought out their targets. It was a group of priests, Jixians by their robes, and the automated soldiers fell upon them like wolves among sheep. The blades of unshatterable glass rose and fell like scythes, and the Jixians screamed as they fell beneath their razor-sharp edges. There was the clatter of glass upon metal, and Tawnod at first assumed that the priests were wearing armor. But when he caught up with his weapons, he saw that the Jixians had replaced parts of their own bodies with machinery, large lumbering, clanking prosthetics that denied them the speed with which to escape. Tawnod looked down at the fallen bodies and wondered if the alterations were voluntary. It smelled of Ashnod's work, but she had never modified the living, only tormented them. Was this something new in Mishra's arsenal? That was when things started to go wrong. There was a whirring noise behind him, the familiar whine of one of his own Yatian soldiers approaching. Tawnod half turned, and in turning realized that the automaton had its blade poised to strike. The master scholar stepped back and stumbled over one of the Jixian's bodies. The fall saved his life, for the soldier's blade cut through the air where Tawnod had been moments before. Another of the soldiers stepped up in front of Tawnod to defend him, and the two Yatian automatons began cutting each other to ribbons. Tawnod rose slowly, the joints in his knees complaining. He looked around. All the Yatian soldiers were fighting among themselves. Their blades of tempered glass cut into each other, peeling away their heavy armor like orange skins. Already some were falling from the assault, but whether they were attackers or defenders Tawnod could not say. Tawnod shouted a command for the unit to form up, and the machines ignored him. He shouted the command for them to cease fighting, and they ignored that as well. Finally he bellowed the order that would deactivate the units. They paid no attention to this order. The battered survivors of the contests only lurched forward to seek new targets. Tawnod took a step back, then a second, then he was running for the center of the line. Two soldiers attempted to follow him but soon fell to fighting each other. As Tawnod moved along the line, the story was the same. The machines on both sides had forgotten their basic orders and were lashing out at random, striking at any target in their path. He found a unit of clay statues in combat with a band of usually allied Avengers, the great automatons pulling chunks of primal clay from the statues' frames. On the horizon, a pair of dragon engines had their necks entwined like mating geese, and each had its jaws wide open, attempting to bite the other's head off. The Triskelions had opened fire on Urza's battle engines and on each other, and already smoke was billowing from their frames. Overhead the clockwork avians were attacking the ornithopters, and their needle-sharp beaks ripped apart the craft's reinforced wings. Tawnod stumbled across human bodies as well, mechanics, guards, other scholars, and Philology warriors. The humans had been the first to be destroyed in the rebellion of the machines. Tawnod heard someone call his name, and there was a flash of scarlet against a black cloak. Ashnod shouted his name again, and Tawnod waited as the woman scrabbled over the fallen body of a clay statue. She was bearing her ubiquitous staff and still carried the battered backpack she had possessed the previous evening. "Is this your doing?" shouted Tawnod over the clashing din. 100 yards away, a headless dragon engine was using its neck as a metallic whip to breach one of the Triskelion towers. Ashnod shook her head emphatically and shouted back, "It's affecting Mishra's devices as well. Maybe something in the way the machines are getting their commands." Now it was Tawnod's turn to disagree. Nothing like this happened before. Maybe the two brothers stones, the Might Stone and Weak Stone. Could their proximity do this? Ashnod shouted, "You tell me. It seems as if everything with a power crystal has a mind of its own." There was an explosion nearby. Too close. Both man and woman crouched as a fireball bloomed skyward, shaking the ground with its eruption. "One of Mishra's war machines," yelled Ashnod. "I'm going to get back to Urza's camp," shouted Tawnod. "Come along." "Thought you'd never ask," replied Ashnod. The two headed away from the line as a great dragon engine, perhaps one of the originals Mishra had brought to Korlanda, rose over the hillock. It regarded the two beings before it as if they were insects. "You have a command word to control that thing?" asked Tawnod. "You think it would listen?" replied Ashnod. The dragon engine hesitated, then turned away, moving back into the heart of the battle. "Something you did," said Tawnod, but Ashnod only shook her head. Then a third voice spoke up. "No, that was me." He stepped into view, and Tawnod saw a creature of nightmares. He was as tall as Tawnod, with long coils that sprang from the back of his skull-like head and twitched of their own volition. His body was constructed entirely of struts and cables held together by sinews of flesh, which twisted like muscles as it moved. He was the ultimate automaton. "Demon," shouted Ashnod. The creature laughed, and it was a harsh, clicking sound. "Is that what you call one who just saved you from your master's devices?" "Yes, I can control it, even if you masters can't. I can control most of these creatures now, and when they are done slaying each other, I will take the strongest ones back with me to Phyrexia." Ashnod dropped the pack and hoisted her staff with both hands. "Get back," she said. The demon laughed again. Now is the time to pack up the toys and go home. Urza and Mishra will die today, and with them fail their hopes and their legacy. He paused for a moment, then added, and their students. The demon crouched to leap, but Ashnod was faster. She brought up the end of her skull-tipped wand, and multicolored energies surged forth from the tip. The creature staggered under the force of the blow but did not fall. You've grown more powerful, he snarled, but his words were forced. I've been practicing, said Ashnod. Tawnod noticed that her teeth were gritted as well. Tawnod, she shouted, take the backpack. Tawnod did not move immediately, instead drawing his own weapon. No, shouted Ashnod, this one is mine. Take the backpack. In it there's a bowl. Tell Urza to fill it with memories of the land. Got it? Memories of the land. Tawnod did not move, and Ashnod cursed. Urza's going to need it, if this thing is here. Already the demon had risen to his feet and was staggering forward, struggling against the beam of Ashnod's staff. As Tawnod watched, his arms grew longer and his fingers sharpened into talons. Sweat was streaming down Ashnod's face. Go, baby duck, she shouted, and redoubled her effort. The demon staggered back a few paces but then resumed his slow progress forward. Tawnod grabbed the pack and turned, running for the base camp. Behind him the demon screamed and Ashnod cursed. Then their voices were lost in the clanging din of the mechanized battlefield.